Well, a very good afternoon to everybody, and thank you very much, as we might once have said, for tuning in to this, our second BRT UK lunchtime masterclass, in which we talk to Leon Daniels, OBE, about the green revolution on the buses. I'm delighted to welcome Leon, whom I've known for 40 years, I realise, but more about him in a minute. To introduce myself briefly, I am James Freeman, and I'll be chairing today's session. I've been a passionate proponent of public transport all my life, and although I retired last March from my full-time job as Managing Director of First West of England in Bristol, I do still take a vivid interest in what's going on around, of course, Chair of BRT UK. And BRT UK can be described, I suppose, as a ginger group. We were formed 15 years ago, or more actually, and our purpose is to spread knowledge and good practice in the field, not just of bus rapid transit, but quality bus operations across the board. For many years, we've done that through the means of popular and successful conferences organised with Landor in different parts of the country. But COVID, of course, put a stop to that. And despite a useful online conference that we had earlier this year, we yearn to get back on the road. Until we can, and we're aiming to run a conference on Merseyside on the 16th and 17th of March 2022, we decided that the best thing we could do was to run the present series of masterclasses. Just an hour, right now, at lunchtime on a Thursday, starting last week and running all through November. Short and sharp, we'll be done by 1:30. Our first speaker in the series last week was David Leader. If you were with us last week, you will have heard him say, in talking about finance generally, what he described as, he talked about 4 meteorites heading for the bus world. One of these was the rapid and wholesale move away from diesel propulsion. With COP26 opening in Glasgow in a couple of days, our environment is certainly a really hot topic right now. And so we looked around for somebody who could explain just what's going on around us. Leon Daniels is somebody who's been taking a particular interest and look at all of this. So who better than he to explain it for all of us? Now, I first met Leon when he was already running one of the more eccentric bus operations in London, an organisation called Obsolete Fleet. That was back in 1981, and since then, Leon has gone on to be a real leader in the bus industry. He developed and owned significant bus businesses up to their sale in 1998 before becoming commercial director for First's UK bus operation. But I suppose he will be best known and most remembered for his period as managing director of surface transport at TfL, including the famous 2012 London Olympics, from which he retired from that role at TfL at the end of 2017. But he hasn't been idle since then, far from it. He's used his experience to get involved all over. He is vice president of the CILT, and Leon, I'm just renewing my membership today, so that's good. And crucially for us, he is a member of the government's Net Zero Transport Board. He was awarded the OBE for services to transport in 2019. We have just time until 1:30, don't forget, for Leon to talk, but also to answer your points and questions. So please put your questions, be brief and clear, and don't turn them into an essay, into the chat, and I'll endeavour to pick them out and put them to Leon when we break for questions. This programme is being recorded, by the way, and lots of people seem to listen afterwards, so that's very good. If you're listening later on, thank you very much. So, Leon, enough of the preliminaries. It's my great pleasure to welcome you as our lunchtime masterclass speaker this Thursday. Over to you.
James, thank you very much indeed, and thank you all for having me. I did a quick look at the people waiting in the lobby, which is always a bit of a worry when you know who's listening. When you do this on stage, the audience is just dark, so that's always very frightening. But as James said, my last proper job was as Managing Director of Surface Transport at Transport for London when I retired from there, and I've taken a particular interest in a whole series of things, mostly to do with the future. So I'm working on autonomous vehicles, I'm working with a couple of tech companies, I'm working with people on the future of ticketing and so on. And I suppose one of the reasons I'm interested in the future is I have less of it to look forward to than many of the audience here today. So I find that helps keep me young, but also because I think history has a bit of a habit of repeating itself. And that really brings me to my first slide, because I call this Back to the Future, because I think we've been here before. So here is London's first fully autonomous, zero emission double-decker bus. There it is. You can see, of course, you can drive it manually by pulling on the reins, or you can just let the horses decide where to go. There are no emissions, certainly not the sort we're concerned about in this webinar. And of course, it's fully recyclable, because at the end of the day, when the horse is too old, you can eat it. So frankly, I think we've been here before. And maybe we should just think back to the fact that the horse tram gave way to the electric tram car. And for many years, Londoners, like people in so many cities around the world, enjoyed the benefit of electric traction. It isn't quite true to say they were completely zero emission, because we were at that time burning coal in order to generate the electricity. And of course, that gives us pollution issues elsewhere. But our cities had the benefits of electric traction. And really, the reason they went, as we know, was the perceived lack of flexibility. We did, of course, have the trolleybus, which gave us more flexibility, and again, running on electricity. And what a terrible shame it was that these were pensioned off all too quickly. And isn't it ironic, we're now racing to get electric vehicles back into our cities? This is just extraordinary. But there we have it. And Londoners were sold this particular story. They were told in the press at the time that this was all about increased flexibility. There'd be cost savings from the maintenance and erection of the overhead line equipment, and that wonderful new flexible diesel bus fleet would give a much better service. Isn't it just funny? That's the opposite of what we're saying now, but there we are. So in March 1972, here we are in Bradford, the last of the UK's electric trolleybus system, and apart from the trams on the seafront at Brighton, from that point onwards, our public transport was all delivered by the internal combustion engine. So, of course, then we became dependent on the internal combustion engine, and in particular, by 1973, just a year after the last of the trolleys in Bradford, we had this problem because of the oil embargo from the Middle East. And here's a surprise, you haven't seen this now for several weeks, a queue at a petrol station. And isn't this just staggering? The nation is hooked on the internal combustion engine, hooked on gasoline and diesel, and here we are paying the consequences for it. My goodness me. Of course, London Transport had led the world on lightweight vehicles. It knew that fuel economy was worth having, but frankly, as the 1970s moved on and into the 1980s, labour became such a high proportion of the cost of running the bus network that frankly the cost of fuel was almost irrelevant. And frankly, that's a disgrace which we should learn from in our history. So electric vehicles are not new. Here we are, look, the famous chloride silent rider, which was part of an initiative in Manchester. And of course, why didn't it succeed? It didn't succeed because battery technology and electronics were nowhere near as advanced as they are now. So it meant a very high weight, and it also meant very, very short range. And the engineers at the National Bus Company had this great idea. What a great idea to actually put a couple of tons of batteries behind the vehicle and tow it around. This is an engine-free Leyland National. The work was done by Ribble, but as soon as they realised what they've done, it went to Crossville, where it had a happy time on the Runcorn Express busway. The trailer was actually heavier than the bus, and it was permanently coupled. It took a long time to charge, and of course, that's all down to the poor battery density of the time. A number of people, of course, made some views clear in the 1970s and 1980s. Colin Buchanan. Present-day double-deckers are the biggest juggernauts there are, he said, and any means of reducing their noise and pollution would be welcome. And I just saw the other day, Noel Millier, who used to be transport correspondent at Commercial Motor and elsewhere, he said, doubtful is the verdict on electric buses. I have challenged him since then about it, of course, but at the time he was right. So I love this slide. This is the greenhouse gas emissions across the world. You can see the vast majority of greenhouse gases, 73.2%, from creating energy. And that creation of energy, 16.2% comes from transport. In fact, 11.9% of it comes from road transport. So that's not air, that's not marine, that's not rail. And it doesn't include the greenhouse gases from manufacturing of transport vehicles. So you can see that if we were to eliminate the greenhouse gases from road transport, that would really be a significant improvement on the emissions map for the world. Road transport is worth having. Aviation, less so, shipping a bit, rail, some. So greenhouse gases from road transport is something we should be actively pursuing. I'm glad we are. So as we move on, I think it's really easy for people to ask the wrong question about zero emission. So let's just go back to fundamentals, shall we? Here is the sun, and the energy transmitted by the sun is free. It's burning away in the sky, it's producing copious amounts of energy, and we don't have to pay for it. And besides the burning of the sun, we've got the wind, an enormous free energy supply. So we've got an abundant source of absolutely free energy. The problem is, the slightly inconvenient bit, is that taking this raw energy and converting it into something we can store, something we can deliver, and something that we can use in a practical way, that's the difficulty. Those are the pieces of the jigsaw that for some time have been missing. And when they haven't been missing, they have been very expensive. So what's really very important here, I think, what's very important is to make sure that we think in terms of the raw free energy and concentrate on how we get it here. So of course, there's no free lunch. Even the march to net zero, with all of its benefits, it's going to bring all this benefit to us, has costs, and these costs are both financial and material. The process uses resources, and resources that we don't currently consume. And the process of converting to either electrical or converting to electrical power or reforming hydrogen creates CO2. And of course, we are trying to stop the production of CO2. For batteries and for fuel cells, you need precious metals. You're going to consume cobalt, you're going to consume lithium, the membrane inside the fuel cell for hydrogen, all these precious metals, which are largely, of course, not renewable. What's more, in the case of precious metals, the good Lord decided to put those precious metals in the ground in countries that either have a poor human rights record or are terribly difficult to access. It creates inefficiencies. And this is something we just have to be thinking about. It creates inefficiencies. Nothing actually has the calorific value of a gallon of diesel. And nothing in the future to give us back our planet and give us back clean air in our cities will ever be quite so efficient in terms of generating energy. But we have to sacrifice that in order to make sure that we have all the benefits that we need. Hydrogen production is only about 35% efficient. But if you challenge Joe Bamford about this, as I did on a webinar some weeks ago, he'll say, who cares? Hydrogen is the most abundant element on the planet. We all have this problem to do with energy transmission, you know. So frankly, who cares if it's inefficient? We have to face the fact that energy has a finite amount of capacity to be transmitted. So the national grid obviously moves electricity. We also have hydrogen. There isn't an obvious hydrogen supply to everywhere we need it. There's not an electricity supply to everywhere where we need it. And so this energy transmission capacity is really an issue. Graham Cooper from National Grid will give you an alternative. He'll say, why don't you park your buses at his substation? Because he's got copious amounts of electricity at his substation. And if you opened your depot there, he could electrify you tomorrow. And guess what? Next week, somebody would open a cafe, then there'll be a Costa Coffee, then there'll be a Sainsbury's, then some houses. And before you know where you are, town planning has been delivered by zero emission electrification around electricity substation communities, building just the way that Victorian railway stations created all those communities all those years ago. And finally, then there's also the energy storage capacity. And we are now being delivered into battery electric in a really good way, because the science, battery density, the efficiency in the use of batteries is rapidly developing, and equally so with hydrogen. But either way, energy needs storage. Storage has capacity limits, and therefore it is an obstacle. Finally, there are the end of life issues. None of this stuff can go to landfill. Therefore, the precious metals, the materials that are being used and so on, we have to have a view for the end of life, because again, just giving ourselves clean air in our cities and reducing CO2 is of course a huge benefit, but if we don't deal with the end of life issues, then we are kidding ourselves that we've done the job properly. Now here's the wrong question, and this is the question that in modern energy discussions we hear far too often. If you're old enough, you'll remember the VHS versus Betamax argument. Those of you who are old enough, this was the fight between two sorts of videotape for the domestic market. Betamax was technically superior in every way, but VHS was more popular. Eventually, VHS became dominant, and indeed, it was finally the only medium. We should try not to have the VHS and Betamax argument that is battery electric versus hydrogen. You see, it's the wrong question. It's not a case of whether battery electric or hydrogen is better. The right question is, what is the best zero emission arrangement for my needs? Because if I'm an urban bus operator where my vehicles come home to the same garage every night, that takes me in one direction. If I'm a long distance coach operator or truck operator, my vehicles might sleep overnight, possibly scheduled, possibly not scheduled, sleeping somewhere expected. That's a different direction to take you. So the question has to be, what is the right technology for the job that I'm trying to do? Well, here's a bit of a surprise. We had our first zero emission buses in London in 2004. These trios of hydrogen powered Mercedes-Benz Citaros, there were 3 each in major cities across Europe and in Reykjavik and in Perth, Western Australia. The first long-term significant project of delivering zero emissions in city centres and using hydrogen. They were very successful. The project was only 2 years, and frankly, it was extended for a third. And then soon after that, we had been to the Shanghai Auto Show and were pursued by the people from BYD who were exhibiting. And as a result, we got these 2 all Chinese BYD single decks that ran in service in London. You can see one of them. There's 2. You can see the other one at the London Bus Museum. So James, you'll see that on Saturday when you bring your guests. Yes, we have in the museum one of the first all-electric buses in London. So BYD now, of course, is a major supplier of battery electric vehicles. There's more than 500 of them running in the UK, and also now from all the other major manufacturers as well. So let's just talk about the case for battery electric. And the reason why it's attractive is it is a rapidly maturing market. There are thousands of vehicles worldwide, and electricity is generally readily available. The power generation, of course, causes its own pollution. So we have to think carefully about how we get our electricity. So I wonder how many people on the call today know what the UK's electrical generation mix is right now. I'll tell you right now, 53% of it is zero carbon. 35% comes from coming right now from wind power, 15% from nuclear, 7% from biomass, 3% from water, only 2% from coal, and 15% from gas. Those numbers change every day, and we need to know what they are. And we don't just need to know what they are locally. We need to know what they are. We need to know not just nationally, but also locally. In London, it's currently 77% renewable. 50% of London's energy at this moment is from wind, 26% from nuclear, only 7% from gas. So this is really important that we understand the green electricity generation that we're putting into our vehicles. The other issue with battery electric is it does need you to replan and reorganize your garages and depots, because in order to make sure that all the vehicles are able to access charging points, especially overnight, then you don't use the garage quite so efficiently. So typically a 100 bus garage would only probably have about 80 electric vehicles with the availability of all the charging points. The other issue with battery electric, as we know, is that despite these great progress in the battery technology, we're still a bit range limited, maybe about 200 miles. So you end up, if you're not careful, with more vehicles than you would normally need. As we've talked about before, we do have the issues to do with precious metals and the end of life issues. And of course, battery electric works best in a temperate climate. So if you are somewhere where you need significant power for air conditioning or significant power for heat, or you're in a very mountainous area, then actually the power drain can be very significant. And that's why, for example, in Hong Kong, the first generations of battery electric vehicles haven't done especially well. So here we are just in Shenzhen, and that's useful because in the suburb of Shenzhen, which is Pingshan, which is the hometown of BYD, this is not only where they make electric vehicles, but the whole city runs on them. All of Shenzhen, not only is the bus fleet fully electric, the taxi fleet is fully electric as well. And the BYD story is interesting, and I think that's a lesson for us all in this debate that we're currently having. So BYD started out as a battery manufacturer. So if you had a BlackBerry or an iPhone, chances are BYD made the battery. So this battery manufacturer moved into automotive, cars, taxis, vans, and buses. So there's a lesson for us all. The winners in the automotive zero emission battery electric market may not be the major traditional vehicle manufacturers. They may well be some technology or battery company that we may never have even heard of that decide to take the skills and bring it into automotive. And finally, of course, just to say now that the sophisticated BYD product we have, over 500 of them now, really an excellent urban bus, 6 years now of partnership with Alexander Dennis, and the great benefit that the majority of this bus is built and assembled in the United Kingdom, and it's the powertrain technology bit that comes from overseas. So the case for hydrogen, well, the problem is it's not yet mature, and also supplies of it to individual locations is still rather limited. And also we have to face the fact that we did start doing this in 2004. 17 years later, we still only have penny numbers of hydrogen. And indeed, supplies of green hydrogen also continue to be limited. You need to create your hydrogen from solar or wind or renewables. Otherwise, you're going to consume some dirty electricity, and that's not where we're trying to get to. But the big advantage for hydrogen is that you fuel it every day like a diesel. It takes a little bit longer than diesel, but broadly, once you've fueled it and washed it, you can park them in lines, which means that you get 100 buses in your 100 bus depot. So the garage utilization is better. The range is easily comparable with diesel. It doesn't use anything like as many precious metals. It just needs some for the fuel cell. And the other good news about hydrogen is that it's got plenty of poke in it. So it doesn't matter about the climate. The hydrogen can easily make heat, can easily generate electricity for auxiliaries, can easily run air conditioning. So hydrogen, the envelope for hydrogen operation is a much wider, bigger envelope than battery electric. So here is the latest Wrightbus hydrogen vehicle at ITT Hub last July. Hope you were there. This particular one is for West Midlands. And one of the things that we can see about the new hydrogen double-deckers, and here's one for London, which is that there is absolutely no compromise in the passenger capacity. Everything to do with the energy, power, storage, etc., is nowhere in the passenger saloon. So this looks like, and indeed is, a perfectly straightforward London double-decker bus. It happens to be powered on hydrogen, and there are no compromises as far as the passenger capacity or passenger environment is on this particular vehicle. So at that point, and noting that we're just about halfway, I'm just going to take a pause and hand back to the chair in case we've got any questions.
And thank you, Leon. Of course we have, as you can imagine. And starting straight on in, Adam Moss is concerned about the cost of all this, and are we likely to end up with a situation where a clean, decarbonised system is too expensive to operate, and we can't afford to pay for it?
It's a really good question, James, of course, and I think there's some evidence to show that when there's sufficient volume, when we have sufficiently advanced electronics, battery density, and so on, that actually we can get this to the price of diesel. So I'm going to quote Joe Bamford from both Wrightbus and Rise Hydrogen. that at 3,000 or 4,000 vehicles, with enough vehicles and with an adequate hydrogen supply, you can make the cost and operations comparable with diesel. Now that's his words, not mine. And of course, he's selling both hydrogen and vehicles. So of course, I wouldn't be surprised. At the moment, it requires substantial public funding for something. And whether that's about the grid capacity, whether it's about the supporting the price of vehicles, which are more expensive than a conventional diesel. But, you know, this is a matter for government.
Yeah,
we all,
absolutely.
of course, want clean cities. We all want our children to grow up without pollution in the air. There is a price to society for that. And we'll hopefully see some more next week at COP26. But the assertion of the question is right. It is more expensive. Would you do it commercially? No. But actually, the commercial bus network in the UK is already now rapidly going back to significant government control. And I would expect government to be pushing this through.
It's in the nature of things, thank you, Leon, that we get more questions and we've got time to answer them. But I'm just going to scoot to Andrew BRTuk, who, as you will well know, Leon, is a bit of an enthusiast for trolley buses, but who says, well, come on, why don't we just get the wires up and mix straight trolley buses, just a more modern version of what we've seen, presumably on your slide, with the in-motion charging battery electrics, which we're beginning to see around Europe.
Andrew, and of course, I've had notice of that question because you raised it on my podcast on itthub.net. Don't forget to go there and subscribe when you were my guest some weeks ago. And as you rightly say, there are plenty of places across Europe where we have some wires up and where with the benefit of battery electric capacity now, all we need to do is to hook up to the wires overhead from time to time as part of keeping the charging going. I agree with you. We don't seem to have made any progress on that. We tried to do it in London and failed. And amongst the reasons we tried in London and failed is that there were some planning issues about the overhead stuff, as you might imagine. But we did really have a plan to do opportunity charging from overhead wires, and it's a great pity that we didn't.
I'm going to squeeze one last one in because I'm really interested in the question myself. As you may know, we were deeply involved in compressed natural gas, particularly from biomethane, and in Bristol and in Reading before that. And John Bickerton, who has forum in Reading, asks whether we'll see a sort of change from zero emission to zero carbon, bearing in mind that there is carbon in quite a lot of electricity.
I think the problem is we're going to go back to the government. The government has already decided on behalf of the public that the internal combustion engine is bad and electric is good, and anything else just doesn't fit the simplicity of the government's position. So the fact is a Euro 6 diesel engine is frankly miraculous in terms of its emissions, but it doesn't help with the argument. And so even CNG made from biomass powering an internal combustion engine, I think politically can't win, not because it doesn't offer all sorts of wonderful advantages. It's just that in the sell that governments give, I think they've said internal combustion engine bad, zero emission electric hydrogen is good,
and zero carbon.
And there's the trade-off. And there's the trade-off. That's what governments do. That's what we pay them for.
Right. It's 1 o'clock, so we better get on. Leon, let's hand back to you and have part 2, please.
Okay. So I am. Yeah. I was just going to spend a minute talking about the integrators, which sounds like a sort of American sci-fi program. But the integrators are some people who are with us who've moved into this particular market. And here's the example of Zenobi, who's a typical integrator. And the question really is, make sure, I'm sorry, chaps. There we are. So what does an integrator do? Well, it does all the technical stuff that you as a bus operator might prefer not to do. For example, if you're worried about how long the batteries will last and what their residual values will be, they'll finance you the batteries. They'll actually take the battery replacement risk. They'll finance the charging infrastructure. In fact, they'll do all of the things that you don't want to do and rent it back to you on a pence per mile basis. And we're looking here at Zenobē with Stagecoach in Guildford. That particular site is really very interesting. There's not enough grid capacity to charge those buses at night. So during the day, their in-house power supply batteries are topped up from the grid. When the buses come in at night, they are charged by a blend of grid and stored power. All that's paid for by Zenobē, and Stagecoach is paying a pence per mile for it. So that's what integrators do. And the other thing they do, of course, is they guarantee you the energy price in the same way you might hedge your price of diesel. Then what you do here is they guarantee the energy price. And what's happening in Guildford and in other locations is that it's acting as a balancer for the grid. And so that spare energy in those batteries is sold back to the grid if it's financially advantageous to do so. Why would you do this? Well, if you're under pressure and you don't have all the skills in-house and you don't know, because there's no data about your batteries or vehicle life or charging infrastructure life or whatever, it de-risks it for you. But let's not forget, the integrators are making a margin, and that margin might have been yours. So they're making a margin on it. It does find second life opportunities for the batteries. When they've finished being any good for automotive, they always work in statics. In fact, some of those batteries that you see are repurposed automotive batteries. And they have the skill to find those homes for the second life batteries. And as I said, it sells your energy back to the grid. I'll come back to the integrators. There's several big names in there at the moment. I'll come back to where I think they might go. I also just wanted to touch for the moment, though. I wanted to touch on the one or two of the alternatives. So here is MAN with its ammonia-powered internal combustion engine. Now, this is really interesting because both hydrogen and ammonia can be used as a fuel. It can be used in a modified internal combustion engine. And there is research going on now across Europe and indeed in the UK in order to provide alternative fuels for modified internal combustion engines that will also give you zero emission. And of course, it is easier and more flexible because you don't need the charging infrastructure. As a bit of a guess as to where this is going to go, I'm not sure it's going to work in a vehicle application, but I could be wrong. I often have been in the past, but it's almost certainly the answer for a number of applications, of which shipping maritime is going to be one of them, where of course it's impossible to hook up to the mains or impossible to find other sources of energy. So really interested to see where things like the ammonia internal combustion engine and indeed the hydrogen cold combustion internal combustion might go. I think that could be quite fascinating. And the other place to watch is, of course, in aviation. So if you've seen the latest design from Embraer, the new Embraer aircraft has two engines with propellers at the back. And why are the engines at the back? Well, that's because one of the things with hydrogen you can't do is store it in long, thin, flat tanks like in wings. They have to be has to be in vertical tanks. And if it's going to be in vertical tanks, it's going to have to be at the back. So you're going to have to put the engines at the back as well. So I think that's really interesting. So we should always keep an eye out. And I'm going to talk about this a bit further, talk about what's happening in the future. So in the UK, we already have over 500 electric buses, over 50 hydrogens. And here's my guess, and this is just a guess, errors and omissions accepted. Firstly, to say that we're going to do this not in isolation, but we're going to do it as part of the UK economy and with global trade. We're going to have to answer the question as to where the 28 billion a year of fuel duty, of how that's going to be replaced, because at the moment there's no duty on electrical power for vehicles. Therefore, the question is, where is that going to come from? It's COP26 over the next couple of weeks, so that's our showcase, which I think is really very important. That's our showcase, and we are going to have to be on the front foot and working across the supply chain and internationally with everybody as to how quickly and how efficiently we can get to zero emission. And we've also got this other big problem, which I think is really very serious, which is that COVID has landed us with a car-led recovery. And I'm already on record as saying that the trouble with this now is that now that congestion and pollution have been divorced, you can now have congestion without pollution. And there are now too many people behind the wheel of their electric car with a smug smile on their face saying they can go anywhere they like because they're not causing any pollution. So let's just look at what we might see in the future. We've got to be really cognizant of what's happening, as I said, in aviation. This is with hydrogen and with truck. We've also got to be considering what's going on with long distance coach, as I said, with HGV and aviation, and also with maritime, because we won't actually cure all this on our own. And we do really need to think very seriously about what's happening in other applications, because as we all know, for too many years, buses have been made out of truck parts. And the combined volumes of bus and truck gave us some economies. We're not going to have that benefit in future because the solutions for truck, solutions for coach, aviation and maritime are going to be different. So here's an interesting thought. I talked earlier about this. We've got over 500 electric buses, over 50 hydrogens. So my bit of a guess, and it is a guess, is that we will end up with a sort of 70, 75, 25, 30 split between battery electric and hydrogen. And why do I say that? Well, I say it because electric is already with us. There's already 500 electric vehicles. And since it's all got to be done by 2040, at least, then frankly, hydrogen is late to that party. And as I said earlier, once you've got electrical charging in your depot, you're probably not going to put some hydrogen fueling in there as well. So therefore, we do have to find, my view is this is where we will get to, and that's because of the start that electric has got, but it can't do everything. And I reckon 25 to 30% of hydrogen will be there. And it is that race to the infrastructure provider. Once you've got it in-house, then you're going to have it in-house for everything. And we will have these new financial models. And the thing that really takes it over, and to pick up the question from earlier, James, about the cost, when you've got big muscle finance companies involved and the integrators, then we're starting to look to pay off the vehicle over 14 years rather than 5 or 7. And that's the one thing, it works on rail, it's the one thing that will happen with zero emission. The cost will be abated because the write-off of the vehicles will take place over a considerable time, and that considerable time will be supported by the banks and by the finance houses as part of the work that they do. So what about obstacles to the future? Well, you're going to laugh at this one. Yeah, politics. Yeah, of course, it's always politics. And you know why? Because political ambition is very short, and converting the £38,000 in the UK to zero emission is very long. So let's be really very clear about this. With 38,000 vehicles in the UK, if you want to get that done in 19 years, the answer is simple. You've got to do 2,000 a year. And 2,000 a year is a lot of buses for the UK. 2,000 units a year is good for us. So you have to get started, and you have to get started quickly, because the later you start, the steeper it will be. The other obstacle, the limitations on power generation and supply do have to be fixed. All over the country and happening now in London, the commencement date of new electric buses is hampered by the electrical installation. There are, RATP Dev has got 50 to 60 zero emission buses parked all over London, waiting for the supplies at Harrow and Fulwell to be completed so that the vehicles can start into operation. Equally, we need that hydrogen infrastructure, and we need proper hydrogen infrastructure, not the way we did it in 2004, where the hydrogen for the RV1 came on a Euro 3 truck from Rotterdam every Monday morning. We need the proper hydrogen infrastructure in place so that green hydrogen is taken economically and efficiently and in a zero emission way to the places where it's needed. And finally, to say that we can't be unconnected to the rest of the industry. We are separate from, but we cannot be totally disconnected from automotive, from aviation, from maritime, and whatever's going on in buildings and in the rest of industry. And then finally, to leave you with a question posed, which is designed to stimulate questions, but looking at the screen, they don't need not much stimulation. Question 1. How long before those integrators are absorbed? Because frankly, if I was a vehicle manufacturer producing a zero emission vehicle, why would I allow somebody else to come in and steal 2 or 3% of my margin by delivering this service to the operators? So I think as the skills that our companies need to look up, to evaluate and deliver zero emission vehicles, I think the integrators might only be there for a short time. I have a suspicion that they'll evolve, because certainly amortizing the price of the vehicles and the charging stations and all the other equipment that goes with it over the longest possible time is a job. But there's a question as to whether that's for a specialist finance house as opposed to somebody who effectively you could consider is actually buying and selling energy and some of the stuff on the way. So it'll be interesting to see, in my view, as to whether operators love integrators the way they like fuel hedging, what they currently do with diesel. So if you like fuel hedging, you'd probably like integrators. If you have fuel hedging, you're paying a premium for it. So if you're happy with the premium for the certainty, that's fine. So the open question, which I don't have a view on, is whether the integrators will survive or whether they'll be absorbed. And I'll go one stage further, because if I'm in the business of manufacturing vehicles, if you're saying to me as an operator, I want a guaranteed low price, I want a guaranteed residual price, I want a guaranteed maintenance price, and I'm going to go to the integrator and I want a guaranteed energy price, and I want to finance batteries, and I want financed charging infrastructure and so on. And do you know what I would do as a manufacturer? I'd go and get some drivers, because actually on that basis, more vertical integration where the operator, the energy provider and the manufacturer are all in common ownership could be an answer to very low margins that exist in several of these businesses, where all wrapped up together, you'd save some of those costs and you would at the same time absorb and amalgamate all of those margins. I don't advocate it. I simply throw it out there to stimulate some questions. That brings me to the end of my slides. I see it is 1:15. So as James has challenged me as a busman to finish on time and leave time for questions, I'm going to hand it back over to James.
Exactly on time. Yes, thank you, Leon. That's absolutely super. And of course, what we're trying to do here is to stimulate thought, isn't it? And I couldn't help smiling this week when I saw a BBC response to the question, what's the cleanest way to travel? Is it public transport, or should I use my car? Oh yes, use your electric car. That's much better than public transport, unless your operator's gone 100% electric. That's quite a challenge, isn't it? The 100%, given that 38,000 figure that you had, is quite scary. So do you think, and Adam Moss came back with his first question straight away again, that we can get the moral high ground back, if you like? Because I think what you're saying, Leon, is that somehow it's been taken from us by the COVID thing, and people seem to think that traveling in their own transport is the right answer and public transport less so. But can we, by being the best answer environmentally, actually grab that moral high ground again?
I'm going to say, it's going to sound like an old cynical person. So I think we can get the moral high ground back. I think we've always had the moral high ground, and I think we have it even more now with zero emission. But I think if I judge our customers, even our young customers, accurately, of course they applaud zero emission, and of course they love all of the work that we're doing. But actually, if the bus is late or dirty, it's just a late or dirty bus. And I don't think that passengers will tolerate lower standards in other areas just for their green credentials. If I judge this correctly, people will take some steps to save the planet, recycling, that sort of thing. People will do things like that, but they won't sacrifice a very large amount of their lifestyle. And therefore, I think we have to work very hard to make sure everything else about the bus journey is as beautiful as it can be, because the green credentials will only help us so far. And if it's late, unreliable, or the driver's grumpy, or it's dirty, then all of our green credentials have gone out of the window. I think the second thing to say about it, and we thank COVID for this, and as I've said more than once now, we had just got some of the most ardent road users over the hill and onto public transport as a combination, James, of your marketing efforts in Bristol and the quality of the service you provided, and of course them being pestered by their children about their poor green credentials. Come COVID, now their car is another room in their house. It's got their CDs in it, it's got their own possessions in it, it's got their own air in it, and therefore it's now the excuse to go back to using their cars because of the risk of infection. Now, we know this is all complete rubbish. We know from the University College work in London, there's not a single case of COVID being found on any hard surface or air quality sample anywhere on the transport system in London. It's all rubbish. Sadly, two things happened. One is, I'm afraid some operators made their vehicles look like a nuclear fallout zone with yellow and black tape and big notices saying keep off. And at the same time, the government put out a message that said don't use public transport. That's harmed us enormously. And I think that it's fair to say that we've got quite a long way to go to rebuild that. I think we have the moral high ground, but we've only got the moral high ground for as long as the quality of what we're delivering is good.
Absolutely, it was ever that, of course. Nothing's new there. Just picking, there's lots of different angles we could take on this, but Stuart Cole comes back to the question of cost, capital cost in particular, and he's talking about the Welsh experience where Traws Cymru buses are costing 150k, obviously Euro 6 diesels, quite small ones, I understand, at that cost, already depreciated over 12 years with a 7-year refurbishment. So, you know, how do we go with this? Last week, David Leader was saying that electric vehicles will last for 30 years. Do you subscribe to that?
It's interesting David should say that, and since you and he and I all work together over the time, I hesitate to contradict him, except to say that the science is moving so fast and the fashion changes so fast. I don't think anybody would keep a car for 30 years, and I'd be surprised therefore if they'd find a 30-year-old bus acceptable. And of course, and it's also just so very hard to predict the future. And this is the answer to a quite different question, but I always think this is funny. The latest aircraft carrier, the Queen Elizabeth and the Prince of Wales, which are only just in service, will have to last so long that the last captain of the Prince of Wales, before it goes for scrapping, has only just been born.
Well, yes, I know that.
So I hate to think.
And all you have to do is sink it, and it's gone.
Yeah.
But I didn't say that.
So how do you plan? So how do you plan for that? So I'd be surprised at 30 years. So, and to go back to Stuart's question, which is a fair one about cost, I would be surprised if 20 or 30 years is doable because of science and because of fashion. Also, if they last 30 years, the manufacturers will all go out of business because there won't be enough volume. If the renewal cycle is 2 to 3 times longer than it is at the moment, and I think there will always be something new. And if we look back, you know, over all our career, James, there's always been something new that gave advantages to somebody: the driver, the passenger, the engineers, the environment, and so on. So I'm afraid we're pinning our hopes on the financial market at 14 to 15 years plus volume, because 2,000 vehicles a year in the UK, if we'd had 2,000 vehicles a year in the UK for the last 20 years, we wouldn't have seen as many casualties in the vehicle manufacturing park as we've seen. So let's hope that those sorts of volumes through to 2040, and I'm quoting 2040, by the way. 2050 is the Paris Agreement. And by the way, do you know there are 2 countries that have hit the Paris requirement for 2050? Suriname and Bhutan have both hit their 2050 deadlines. But for the rest of us, 2050. But I'm taking 2040 as the benchmark for 2 reasons. That's already 19 years away, so we're starting to renew the zero emission fleet by then anyway. And secondly, whilst 2050 might be the Paris Agreement, London 2035, Birmingham, Manchester 2037. So there are so many local deadlines which are much earlier than 2050, indeed earlier than 2040. For me, 2040 is the yardstick.
So just coming back to the thought of the passing of time, it's not very many years ago since the Chinese were, as they still are, very much in the forefront of electric technology in many ways. But the Chinese flavour has gone out of fashion, big style, hasn't it? Down in the southwest, we've got that great power station project at Hinkley Point, and I'm hearing government ministers saying, "Oh, Chinese," or question mark, exclamation mark. So how do you see that playing out in the British scene?
Well, we did allude to it earlier as well, which is, of course, is that the Building Britain Back Better talks about a domestic-led recovery, and the Transport Decarbonisation Plan talks about doing it by day after tomorrow.
Yeah.
And you really can't do it by the day after tomorrow without international help. And I'm sorry, but the truth is the precious metals are in other countries. There's not enough of the right sort of stuff here. And secondly, some of those countries, and China is one, is well ahead in this technology. So I take the point. There's always a whiff of anti-Chinese sentiment, which varies depending on the political climate and the discussions about Taiwan and relationships with the US and all the rest of it. But we have to do this internationally because we don't have the science, the technology, or the precious metals here to do it all of ourselves. I quoted the ADL arrangement with BYD. Shortly, the Chinese bits of those are coming in a crate, and will all be assembled in Falkirk or Scarborough. They won't be what it is now, which is a finished chassis arriving here. So I think we'll see some moves to camouflage or reduce the exposure of how much of this stuff is coming from overseas. But I'm afraid to say we do have to recognise that some of these countries have further developed the skills, and if we have to do it by the day after tomorrow, we're going to have to accept that.
Interesting. Now, time is our enemy as ever, and we are almost at the end of this. But I'll take go from one more direction, but brief answer, please. Keith Homer says, "What if, bearing in mind the integration point that you made earlier, Leon, actually the integration went the other way, and you use the public authority to drive back up the pile, if you like, rather than downwards, as you were describing?"
I'm not sure I quite understand that. So
in other words, I guess that I mean, I'm thinking the question. Let me read the question. Vehicle and fuel supplier integrating service operation makes sense if public authorities take patronage risk onto their books, like TfL. And on we go, thinking about Manchester and so on.
Well, I mean, I think it's fair to say that the penetration now of the public sector into bus operations following the government's strategy plans
changed a lot, hasn't it?
They're in there anyway. They are in there anyway. I have always believed that the private sector should do what it does best and the public sector should do what it does best. It has always been my experience when one tries to do the other's job, they don't do it very well. And so for me, I hope we keep the correct blend of public and private sector interest. And I'm going to say this on London because after all, I was responsible for it for so long. You can have London quality, frequency, fares, and lots of shiny new buses if you've got the money. And frankly, that money is taxpayers' money. And therefore, so my message to the Manchesters, Birminghams, and so on, all this is you can have anything you like. But actually, Mrs. Smith only wants to pay £1.50. And the difference between the aggregation of all those £1.50s and the cost of running your network is going to have to be paid by somebody, and that's probably the taxpayer. And since the taxpayer gets a vote, then the taxpayer can have what it likes. So that's the macro point. The micro point on that is that what's the public authority's job in this? I think it's to reflect what the population wants, and I think its job is to deal with the strategic planning and is to provide the conduit for the public money so that the private sector can deliver what the public wants.
Ah, there you are. But it has, the landscape has changed, hasn't it? So
Absolutely.
there's no two ways about that. Leon, we are and everybody come to that. We've arrived at the back end of this time already. It's amazing how quickly it all happens, isn't it? Thank you, Leon, for a fascinating session, and thanks to all of you, our audience, for your interest and for all your comments and questions. And I'm only sorry that we can only take a small proportion of them actually on air. Now, this program has been recorded and will be available through Landor Links. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the team at Landor Links, Juliana, Daryl and Justin. You're behind the scenes working so hard to make it work technically. The same brilliant team, by the way, is working with us at BRT UK to bring us and you our first post-COVID Be There or Be Square in-person conference in Liverpool next year. The dates penciled in, to remind you, are 16th, 17th of March 2022. So if you're interested, do please keep those dates free in your diaries, and there'll be far more details closer to the time. Next week now, in the third of these 6 lunchtime masterclasses, we'll be drilling down a bit deeper into a specific area of bus priority expertise, thanks to a presentation by TfL's bus priority team. So John Haynes and Giuliano Gianforte will speak on London's bus lanes and the 24/7 city, which promises to give us insight into latest experiences and best practice at a time when bus speeds in London have been coming under considerable pressure. So do please register again and join us next week at 12:30, Thursday, 4th of November. And remember, these BRT UK masterclasses are going out every week through November. So Leon, thank you again very much indeed. And thanks to all of you, our audience. This is James Freeman signing off for BRT UK. Until next week. Goodbye.